Hello RubyConf. I'm going to be talking about using Monads for elegant error handling. My name's John Gallagher and I'm a lead developer at Bigger Pockets and an automation consultant for my own business. But before we start, a little bit of a warning for you. Many of these slides are going to contain extremely cheesy stock imagery for comedy purposes, and you'll know because bing, you'll get a little bit of cheese in the top right hand corner. So let's get going. This is the first photo that is pretty cheesy. So this person here is obviously thinking, who stole my finger puppet? And this person is obviously thinking, did I leave the shower on this morning? So imagine you're in a meeting like this and you're deciding what the next feature you want to build is, and you decide, okay, it's this. You do some refinement of the card and you start coding like a good developer, and off you go. You do TDD, right? Because everybody loves TDD here, we're all Rubyists. And so off you go with your coding, and you make the happy path, and you make an edge case, and at some point, if you're anything like me, you stop and you think, hang on, have I caught all the failure modes for this piece of code? Have I caught all exceptions? And more importantly, have I caught the right exceptions? And then what would the customer see if this piece of code went wrong? What should they see? So I want to take a little bit of an example here of editing your address. Now imagine you have stored the contact details of a customer in an external API, something like Office 365, for example. And let's say you get to a stage in the process, let's say it's a checkout process, where you want to show them a list of all addresses to select for their postcode, or if you're in the US, their zip code. So this drop down might contain 1 Main Street, 5 Main Street, 3 Main Street, and a whole bunch of other addresses. So the first thing you want to do is make an API call to get the postcode that you've previously stored. So you want to find the contact. Every API call, of course, can succeed or fail. So what happens if it fails? Well, you decide we will just want to render an error to the customer. We just want to give up. There's nothing more we can do here. If that API call is a success, it will come back with a postcode, of course. And from that postcode, we can then do a lookup. What addresses are at that postcode? Or again, zip code if you're in the US. Now, of course, that is a second API call, and that can fail as well. If it succeeds, we just want to render a select on the screen with all the addresses from that the customer can see, that the customer can select. If it fails, we want to render a manual address entry screen. So the state, the zip code, the street, so that the customer isn't prevented from taking the next step. How would we do that in a standard Ruby way using exceptions? Here's what it might look like. So you would have a class maybe called findContact, and it would have a standard method called call. It passes in the ID that it wants to look up. Rails.configuration.api, this would just call out to Faraday. So this is a Faraday connection. And we're going to call .get that URL. And this is a JSON API. So it's going to return a body with some JSON that we pass. We fetch the contact key out and return that. If there's any error, we rescue Faraday error, or maybe we rescue JSON parser error. This is something my colleagues have seen a few times where maybe an API will return a 200 success, but it's got malformed JSON in because somebody somewhere has made a little mistake. So we want to catch both those exceptions because those indicate something has gone wrong. Incidentally, Faraday error also includes things like timeouts. Now what happens if there's any error? We want to return nil. Why nil? Well, nil in this case is a special value. It's indicating to the client something went wrong, we can't complete the operation. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Lookup postcode is very, very similar. It still does an API call, it still parses a JSON, this time it fetches the addresses key. What happens if there's an error? Well, we decide, oh, let's pass back an empty array of addresses this time. So what would the controller code look like? Well, it might look a little bit like this if you're using Rails. We do a find contact, and we return if that contact is nil. Obviously, we render the error screen as well, but we stop ourselves at that point and we exit early. If the contact is anything, we continue and we look up the postcode. And if there are any addresses in that array that comes back, we render the address select screen, else we render the manual address entry screen. Okay, but there are a few problems with this approach. Number one, we're returning nil. Now, I have a big beef with Ruby developers inserting nil into their programs. Occasionally I've done the same thing myself, but Tony Hawk calls nil his billion-dollar mistake, and there's a good reason for that. If anyone calls any method on nil, apart from obviously nil question mark and a few others, it's going to blow up. We don't want our code to blow up. Why would we introduce nil deliberately? The client also knows too much. The client, which in this case is the controller, knows what nil means. It knows what empty array means. And I want to ask you this. What in this code back here is the difference between finding a contact that doesn't exist and finding a contact that does exist but the call failing? Well, in the case of a contact that doesn't exist, it's going to give a 404. We're going to rescue the Faraday error and return nil. In the case of the API call failing, maybe the API is down, maybe there's a timeout issue, it will still return nil. Those two cases amount to the same thing, but they're not the same thing, are they? So the client knows that nil is a special case. It also knows that an empty array is a special case. And in a sense, we're saying nil means the operation was a failure. So the client has to know that, is the point. So there's a coupling there. You can't just go in and change that code without changing the controller code too. And then that kind of brings us on to our next problem. There's no convention for what to return. Is it nil? Is it empty string? Is it empty array? It's up to us. Oh great, another decision that we need to make as developers. We all love making more decisions than we need to, right? Not really. It's just an extra cognitive load on us. And what is the end result? I think the end result of this is sometimes customers get software that's a bit broken because we haven't really thought through those exception cases, or if we have, maybe we're returning nil. And maybe, maybe we call the method on that nil by accident. Who knows? The end result for us as developers, for me as a developer at least, is doubt and decision fatigue. I don't know about you, but when I've left code like this, I've got a nagging sense in the back of my head. I've missed something here. It's complete as far as I can test it, but there's a nagging sense of doubt, of it's sort of finished, but it's not finished really. So what's a solution to this? Well, until recently I didn't really have a great one, but I've discovered monads. And there's something called a result monad. Monads can be used for a lot of things, but let's talk about result monad specifically. Well, a result monad, obviously I know you can read lots and lots of blog posts and lots of category theory about what a monad is, but really when it comes to a result, it's pretty simple. It's a class that represents success or failure. It's got a consistent interface, and as you'll see later, that means we can compose lots of little steps together. And in the case of a success, this object wraps the value. In the case of failure, it wraps the error. So let's refactor the code that we had before to Monads and see what happens. The first thing we need to talk about is how do you create a success or a failure? I'm going to be using the dry Monads gems for all these examples. We create success by using the success class, unsurprisingly, and we can pass in a number. In this case, the value is 42 that we want to operate on. You can do success.new if you wish, but dry Monads gives you this nice syntactic sugar with open brackets, close brackets, and you don't have to have all of this noise of .new everywhere. So it has these question mark methods, as you might imagine, and then it has value.bang. Sorry, value bang. Value bang unwraps the value inside the success. Why is it bang? You'll see in a minute. What about failure? Failure gives you the same interface. In this case, failure wraps the error. Now you can pass in anything you want in here. In this case, I'm using a symbol, but it could be an exception. It could be an instance of exception. It could be an open struct. It's up to you. However, if you call value bang on the failure, what does the value of failure mean? It doesn't mean anything. So you can't really do it. It blows up if you try and do that. So the takeaway from this is, if you're using these and you're using something which might be a success or a failure and you want to unwrap the value in, you need to question it first of all to establish it's a success. And once you know it's a success, then you can call .value bang on it. So let's take this code that we had before and convert it to using success and failure. Here's what it would look like. First of all, we include dry monads. Second of all, we wrap what was coming back, this will be a hash, in a success. So it's now a success wrapping a hash instead of just a plain old hash. And finally, we rescue that error exception and we wrap it in a failure. Now this is super cool because it means we have that error later on in whatever we want to do with it. We'll come on to more examples with that later on. What about lookup postcode? As you might imagine, it's a very similar thing. We include dry monads, we wrap it with a success. In the case of an exception, we wrap the error with a failure and we pass it back. What would the controller look like? This is what the controller code looked like before. How is it going to change with monads? Okay, not massive changes. We've taken the nil check and converted it to a failure check. That means it's going to exit early if it's a failure. Now that we know we've got a success, we can call value bang on the result and fetch the postcode out of that as usual. And then we can call success. If the operation was a success, then we render our address select screen and we unwrap the value stored in that success and put it into some locals, render the view, and off we go. So that's it. That's all I've got. I've been John Gallagher. Thanks for your time. But wait, you are probably looking at this and thinking, what is the point? You've now got all these .value bangs everywhere. You've got a failure question mark. You've got success. Is this really any better? I mean, it's slightly better. You've now got access to the error inside failure, but this code doesn't even use it. So what on earth is the point of this? Well, we're not finished yet. Hold your horses, because we're going to convert it to a pipeline, and this is where the real value of monads becomes apparent. First of all, we need to talk about how we're going to handle these success and failure cases. Obviously, on that previous slide, we were doing if it's a failure, then do this. If it's a success, do this. We don't want all this if else. We just want a pipeline. How are we going to do that? We're going to use something called fmap. So here's how fmap works. Fmap takes an object, it takes a monad. If that was a success, it unwraps the value inside it and passes it into a block. Executes the block, takes the return value of that block and wraps it up again in success. It's a way of saying if the previous step was a success, do the block and wrap it back up in a success. What about a failure? The fmap is going to ignore it altogether and it's going to pass straight through. What about failures? How are we going to handle them? We use something called OR. Here's what OR does. We've got a success, we call OR on it, and it just returns that success. The success goes straight through the OR, passes through, and nothing happens. In the case of a failure, it executes the block. It unwraps the object inside the failure. So in this case, the thing passed into that block will be a symbol of divide by 0. That's what the E is. And then it will execute airbreak.notify symbol divide by 0. Now the real power comes when we chain these two together. Here's what that looks like. Let's say we have a success and we're going to do .fmap and then .or. What's going to happen here? Well, fmap is going to see the previous stage was a success. It's going to unwrap that 42. It's going to pass it into x. X times 2 is 84. Look at me with my maths. How amazing am I? 84 is going to wrap that back up with a success. And then the OR is going to execute. Now it's going to see that it's a success and just let it straight on through. So the airbreak.notify will not be triggered. What happens in the other case of a failure? Yes, you guessed it, the fmap block will not be executed and the OR block will be executed. So let's take our controller code that we had before, still using monads, but using this if-else terminology. And let's change it to use pipelines. Boom. Okay, so this looks quite a bit different. You can see that the find contact.new.call, I've just split it out into separate lines. So that line, it's not really that different. I've done the same with lookup postcode.new.call, just so that we can get that pipelined effect. But the things to really call out are the OR here. The OR is going to execute if that find contact failed. So it's going to render our edit with error, and because of the way that lambdas work in Ruby, the return is going to return inside the controller method. And so at that point, the code will halt as it did before, and we've got our error screen. If you might be thinking, so what happens when it's successful? You don't have an fmap handling that. Well, that's cool. Result will just contain that success. And the success will just glide on by. It doesn't need an fmap to handle it if we don't want to. And then finally, we do result.value.fetch postcode. We pass that into lookup postcode as we did before. And the result of that is going to be a success or failure. So now it's pretty simple, right? fmap deals with the success, or deals with the failure, and that's it. We are done. So here's what the two bits of code look like side by side. On the left is the old style with exceptions, and on the right is the newfangled fancy pants with monads. Cheese! So I don't really know what's going on here. No driver, in fact no person is looking at the road, which cannot be good for road safety, surely. And all four people are smiling in a way that you very, very rarely see any. Have any four people ever been this happy in the history of humanity? I would guess not. So that's another little bit of cheese for you. And to make matters worse, I've added my own super cheesy caption. Yeah, turn it up to 11. That's a Spinal Tap reference. Anyway, so what do I mean by that? I mean, let's take this to its logical conclusion. The code you saw on the previous slide with that pipeline, you know, you might be thinking it's still not that compelling. You've got to understand all of this stuff that I've been talking about. You've got to understand fmap and .or. So is it really worth it? Well, have a look at this. This is what can happen when you're adding loads of extra stuff to your controller, and you can now slot in extra steps in the pipeline. You can have more ORs. You don't need to just have one. You can have an OR and pass it down to another OR. You can have multiple fmaps. And this starts to make your code not only more readable, not only more composable, but more extendable. So you can see these ampersand find contact, ampersand notify. We've not talked about that. That's just a way of passing a lambda in and naming the lambda. I found that really useful for just describing what a lambda is doing. So what are the benefits of this approach? Well, we've just talked about a few of them. You've got this readable pipeline. It scales well. The more complexity you add into your controller, the more this scales. It also, I find, helps your thinking. So if I've got a pipeline and I've got an OR in there and no fmap, that's a sign, okay, maybe I've not handled success. And vice versa. If I've got a .fmap but I don't have an OR, was that deliberate or was that an accident? It's there in my code. I can see the error handling. And then the other big advantage, as I mentioned before, is failures store errors. So we can do stuff with that error. Way back in the day, right at the beginning, I'm not going to skip back to the slide, you might remember the slide with exceptions, and we were rescuing and we were just returning nil. What happened to the error? What happened to the exception? It just got thrown away. We said, we don't really care, we're just going to return nil. So what would you do if you wanted to log that to Airbrake, if you wanted to send that to New Relic maybe? Well, you'd have to change that code. You'd have to add a new line. You'd have to, you know, say airbrake.notify error inside the API. Whereas this way you get to do outside. You have that flexibility. You can defer that decision until much later. But of course, as we all know, it's not sweetness and light. Everything is a trade-off, blah, blah, blah. So there are some drawbacks with this approach. First of all, you've got more boilerplate code. You've also got more dependencies. Of course, dry monads is a gem. It's not built into Ruby. You're also breaking some of the Ruby idioms because Ruby isn't really designed to do this monadic kind of style. And lastly, that means there's a lot more to understand. And if your team members don't really understand this, yeah, might not be such a good idea. If you're going to approach this as a team, have a team discussion and see, is it worth it for you? Do you want to give this a shot? But do it as a team. Cheese! So this person has some really quiffy hair and he's got specs on a bit like mine, so he must be a geek and he's got some books. So what does that mean? It's obviously time for a quiz. Maybe? I don't really know how that image says quiz, to be honest, but there we go. So here's the code. I've excluded a little bit of the include dry monads. I've just left that out for simplicity. So we've got self.call. If the postcode that we pass in is present, we're going to return a success with the street and postcode. Else we're going to return a failure. So obviously no one would write this actual code. That would be a pretty bad idea for all sorts of reasons, wouldn't it? But let's take this as an example. Question number 1. There's only 2 questions, by the way, so don't think we're going to be here for 10 minutes with 10 different questions. Here is the code that calls that address finder. Okay? What is the result going to be? A, B, or C? Give you a moment for that. Okay, the answer is C. Why is that? Well, we're passing in a postcode that is not nil and not blank, so it returns a success. So at the fmap, we're going to be passing in a success. Fmap loves successes and wants to operate on them. So the address variable in fmap will return a hash with street and postcode in it. It fetches the street, so that will be 81 Main Street, and then it upcases it. And remember, fmap wraps it back up in success again. So we get 81 Main Street, all in caps, wrapped with a success. How did you do? Did you get that right? Well, never fear, because there's a second question. Here's the code. Almost exactly the same. The only difference is we've got a blank postcode. What is going to happen here? What's going to be executed? Okay, when you're ready, shout it out. Shout it out. I can't hear you. I think you're on mute. Oh, it's a recorded talk. Never mind. It is going to be A. So it's a failure. The fmap skips over the failure. The failure is operated on by the OR block. The symbol not found is unwrapped into error. And then it calls airbreak.notify error. An error is not found. So finally, I've set up a little practice using GitHub assignments. It's super cool. Anybody can do it. If you're watching this as a YouTube video and you're watching it back, please do it as well. The URL is bit.ly/eleganterrors, all one word. Run through the exercise, submit a PR, and I can take a look at it, ask any questions you've got about it, and hopefully this will help you actually understand how to do it. And thank you for all your time. I've been John Gallagher. I'm a lead developer at Bigger Pockets. I run my own business, and here are some of my difficult to remember Twitter and LinkedIn handles. Synaptic Mishap on Twitter and LinkedIn, and John Gallagher on GitHub. Okay, hopefully see you on the other side, and thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.